You never look the Alpha King of the North in the eye, and you certainly never refuse to bend the knee." When Margaret stood tall in a room full of staring nobles, she braced for his legendary wrath. Instead, the ruthless king dismissed his entire court. Then came the heavy, terrifying click of the great doors locking behind them. They were completely alone. And that is when the king whispered the one thing she never saw coming. The great doors of Ashford Castle swung open, and Margaret of the Thornwood stepped into a sea of silk and candlelight, and did not curtsy. The murmur began low, somewhere near the long trestle tables where the lesser lords were already deep into their second flagon of mulled wine. It rippled outward like a stone dropped into still water, reaching the high table where the Alpha King sat with his brother at his right hand. By the time Margaret had walked 10 paces into the hall, the murmur had become a hush, and the hush had become the kind of silence that makes a room feel like a held breath. She felt the weight of it. 200 eyes, maybe more, all fixed on the woman in the plain woolen gown who had walked into the harvest feast of the Alpha King without so much as a nod of deference. Her own hands, rough and calloused from a lifetime of work, hung steady at her sides. She did not look at the floor. She did not look at the candles. She looked straight ahead at the man on the dais, and she held his gaze the way a person holds a blade, carefully, but without flinching. "Margaret of the Thornwood," the herald announced, his voice cracking on the name as if he could not quite believe he was speaking it aloud. A ripple of whispers. "That's the widow of the Thornwood chief, the one who—" "Shh, not here, not now." Margaret kept walking. She had made a vow, 11 years ago, standing over a grave in the frozen ground, that she would never bend her knee to any authority again. Not to a lord, not to a king, not to anyone who expected her to prove her worth by the depth of her bow. She had kept that vow through famine, through war, through the long years of scraping a living out of the Thornwood's thin soil. She was not about to break it for a man in a crown, no matter how many cattles they lit in his honor. She stopped at the edge of the dais, a respectful distance from the high table, and she stood there, straight, still. Her chin lifted just slightly, the way it did when she was digging in her heels about something. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the back of the hall, a dog whined, a woman coughed, and the sound was swallowed by the hush. Edmund of House Ashford, the Alpha King's younger brother, rose from his seat with a scrape of wood against stone. He was a tall man, lean where his brother was broad, with the same pale hair but without the silver threading through it. His face had the pinched look of a man who had just bitten into something sour. "You," his voice carried across the hall like a whip, "you will kneel before the Alpha King of the North." Margaret tilted her head, just a fraction. "I will not." The words fell into the silence like stones into a well, and the well was deep. Edmund's face went from sour to thunderous. He took a step toward her, and the guards at the edge of the hall shifted, hands moving to the hilts of their swords. "You are a guest in this house," Edmund said, his voice low and dangerous. "And you will show the respect that—" "Edmund," the voice came from the high table, quiet and unhurried, and it cut through his brother's tirade like a knife through soft cheese. Edmund stopped mid-sentence, his mouth still open, and turned. William of House Ashford, the Alpha King of the North, had not risen from his seat. He sat with one elbow resting on the arm of his throne, his chin resting on his knuckles, his grey eyes fixed on Margaret with an expression that was impossible to read. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick-armed, the kind of man who looked like he had been carved out of the same stone as his castle walls. His pale hair, silver-streaked at the temples, was pulled back from his face, and the scar on his left cheekbone caught the candlelight as he turned his head. "The lady has made her position clear," he said, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who had never once in his life had to raise it to be obeyed. "There is no need to repeat it." "William," Edmund started. "Edmund." The Alpha King's voice did not change, but something in it shifted, like the first creak of ice before it breaks. "Sit down." Edmund's jaw tightened, but he sat. The guards at the edge of the hall relaxed, hands falling away from their swords. The hush returned, but it was different now. Less shocked, more watchful. The whole room was waiting to see what the Alpha King would do with the woman who had just publicly defied him in front of every lord and lady in the north. William rose from his throne. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way a large man moves when he knows exactly how much space he takes up and doesn't care. He walked down the steps of the dais, his boots echoing on the stone floor, and he stopped a few paces in front of Margaret. He was taller than her by almost a head. She had to look up to meet his eyes, and she did, without apology. "You are Margaret of the Thornwood," he said. It was not a question. "I am. The widow of Aldrich." This time it was harder to keep her voice steady. "I was his wife." "And you would not bend your knee to me," he said it almost thoughtfully, as if he were turning the idea over in his mind like a smooth stone. "Not even for the sake of the feast. Not even to spare yourself the trouble." "I did not come here to spare myself trouble," Margaret said. "I came because your herald told me that if I did not attend, the Thornwood would loathe its grazing rights in the northern valleys." William's eyebrows lifted, just slightly. "And that is why you came? To protect your grazing rights? My people need those valleys to feed their flocks through the winter. If that means I have to stand in a room full of silk and candlelight and be stared at like a strange beast at a fair, then that is what I will do." She paused. "But I did not say I would like it, and I did not say I would bend my knee to earn it." A sound rippled through the crowd. Not quite a laugh, not quite a gasp. Someone in the back of the hall let out a low whistle of admiration. Edmund's face, Margaret noticed with a small, grim satisfaction, had gone the color of old porridge. William studied her for a long moment. His gray eyes moved over her face, her scarred brow, her sun-darkened skin, the rough weave of her gown. He did not look at her the way the other lords had looked at her, like a piece of furniture that had wandered into the wrong room. He looked at her like he was reading a page in a book, and finding it more interesting than he had expected. "Margaret of the Thornwood," he said, and his voice was quieter now, almost gentle. "I have been Alpha King of the North for 20 years. In that time I have had lords and ladies kneel to me, and I have had them lie to me, and I have had them flatter me. But I have never—" He paused, and a ghost of something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I have never had one of them walk into my hall, look me in the eye, and tell me they would rather be at home tending their sheep." The crowd went very, very quiet. "William," Edmund said from the high table, his voice tight with warning. The Alpha King did not look at his brother. He was still looking at Margaret, and there was so meaving in his eyes now that she could not name. It was not anger. It was not amusement. It was something older and sadder and more careful. "Leave us," William said, without raising his voice. For a moment no one moved. Then, slowly, like a tide going out, the guests began to rise from their seats. They filed toward the doors, casting backward glances over their shoulders, whispering behind their hands. Edmund was the last to move, and he moved slowly, his eyes fixed on his brother with an expression that was equal parts confusion and something darker. "William," he said, low enough that only the three of them could hear, "you cannot mean to—" "Edmund." William's voice was still quiet, but it had an edge to it now, like a blade that had been sharpened too many times. "I said leave us." Edmund left. His footsteps echoed in the emptying hall, and then the great doors swung shut behind it with a boom that seemed to shake the very stones. And then there was the sound of a key turning in a lock. Margaret heard it clearly, the click of the bolt sliding home, and her heart gave a lurch that she refused to acknowledge. She did not step back. She did not flinch. She stood her ground, her hands steady at her sides, and she watched the Alpha King of the North walk to the doors, turn the key, and slip it into his pocket. The hall was empty now except for the two of them, and the candles and the long shadows they cast across the stone floor. William turned back to face her. He was not angry. That was the strangest part. His face was open, almost tired, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a familiar landmark he had not expected to see again. "You are wondering," he said quietly, "why I locked the doors." Margaret did not answer. She was too busy trying to read the expression on his face and finding that she could not. "I locked them," William said, "because I did not want anyone else to hear what I am about to say." He took a step toward her, and then another, until he was close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver in his hair, the way the scar on his cheekbone pulled slightly when he spoke. "You are not here to curtsy to me," he said. "You are here to collect a debt." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "I don't know what you mean." William's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. It was too sad for that, too old. "The winter of the Grey Famine," he said, 22 years ago. You were a girl then, with a thick braid down your back and a basket of bread in your arms. You walked through a snowstorm to the edge of the Thornwood, where a boy was hiding in a barn, a boy who had run away from his father's army because he was too weak to fight. Margaret felt the floor shift under her feet. She remembered. She remembered the cold and the snow and the boy with the pale hair who had flinched when she held out the bread. She remembered thinking he looked like a stray dog, all ribs and fear and two bright eyes. "You," she whispered. "I," William said. And then, very quietly, he added, "I have been looking for you for 22 years, Margaret of the Thornwood. And now that I have found you, I find that you will not even curtsy to me." He laughed, and the sound was strange in the empty hall, rough and rusty, and somehow more honest than anything she had heard all night. "I am not sure," William said, "whether I should thank you or throw you in the dungeon, but I think—" He stopped, and his gray eyes met hers, and for a moment he looked less like a king and more like that boy in Hebron, all ribs and fear and two bright eyes. "I think I would like to know why you stopped to give that bread to a boy you did not know. And why, after all these years, you still refuse to bend your knee to anyone." Margaret opened her mouth to answer, but the words would not come. She stood in the empty hall, under the flickering candles, with the Alpha King of the North watching her with those tired, careful eyes, and she found that for the first time in 11 years, she did not know what to say. The silence stretched between them like a thread pulled too thin. Margaret stood with her hands clasped in front of her, the rough wool of her skirt brushing against her ankles, and she could feel the weight of his gaze without looking up. William did not move from where he stood by the long table. He reached for the carafe of wine that had been left behind by the departing guests, poured a measure into a clay cup, and set it on the edge of the table nearest to her. "Drink," he said. It was not a command. It came out softer than he had intended, and he seemed to know it, because he cleared his throat and looked away. "You have traveled far tonight. The roads are cold." Margaret looked at the cup. Then she looked at him. "You are asking me to drink wine with you, in a locked hall, at midnight, after you dismissed every noble in the kingdom to keep me here." "Yes," William said simply. "Why?" He did not answer at once. He poured a cup for himself and took a long drink, and the firelight caught the gray in his hair and the scar on his cheekbone. He looked older than she had expected, and tireder, and somehow smaller without the crown, though he had not removed it. He had not even touched it. "Because I have waited 22 years to ask you a question," he said, "and I would rather ask it without 100 people watching you flinch." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I do not flinch." "No," he agreed, "you do not. That is why I locked the doors." She stared at him. The wine sat between them, steaming faintly in the cold air of the hall, and she found herself reaching for it, not because she trusted him, but because her hands were shaking and she did not want him to see. The wine was dark and strong, and it burned going down. It warmed her from the inside, and she hated how much she needed it. "You asked me a question," she said, setting the cup down. "Two, in fact. You want to know why I gave you bread? And why I will not curtsy." William nodded. He leaned back against the table, crossing his arms, and the movement made him wince almost imperceptibly, a flicker of pain that crossed his face and was gone before she could name it. "I want to know," he said, "what kind of girl walks through a blizzard to feed a boy she has never met, and then grows into a woman who will not bend her knee to the man the boy became?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. The candles guttered in the draught from the shuttered windows, and she watched the shadows dance across his face. The girl was hungry herself, she said at last. She knew what it was like to be cold and afraid and alone. She saw a boy in a barn, and she thought— She stopped. She thought someone should feed him, that is all. There was no more to it than that. There was more to it than that, William said quietly. I have never forgotten that bread. I have never forgotten the girl who gave it to me. I have spent 22 years looking for her, and I have asked myself 1,000 times why she did it, and I have never found an answer that satisfied me. Perhaps, Margaret said, because there is nothing and some things are done for no reason but that they are the right thing to do. He looked at her then, and something in his gray eyes shifted. It was not anger, and it was not pity. It was something closer to recognition, as if he were seeing her for the first time, not as the woman who had refused to curtsy, but as the girl who had walked through the snow. "And the curtsy?" he asked. Margaret's hand tightened around the cup. She set it down carefully, deliberately, and she met his eyes. "I have curtsied to a man once in my life," she said. "I bent my knee to him, and I gave him my trust, and he used it to destroy everything I loved. I will not make that mistake again." William was very still. "Your husband?" "My husband," she agreed. "He was the leader of the Thornwood, and he was a good man, and he was a fool. He thought that if he bowed low enough and smiled sweetly enough, the old king would spare us. He was wrong. He bowed, and they took our grain, and they took our dignity, and when the harvest failed, they took his life." The words came out flat and even, like stones dropped into still water. She had said them so many times in her own head that they had lost their sharp edges, but saying them aloud, to him, felt different. It felt like pulling a splinter out of an old wound. "I swore that day," she said, "that I would never bend my knee to anyone again. Not to a king, not to a lord, not to any man who thinks a lowered head is the same as a loyal heart." William did not speak for a long time. The fire popped and settled, and the wine sat forgotten between them, and the silence was not hostile. It was the silence of a man who was thinking very carefully about what he wanted to say. "Your husband," he said at last, "was Aldrich of the Thornwood. You know his name." "I knew of him. I was not on the throne when he died. My father was, and I have often wondered if my father's cruelty to the Thornwood was the reason I never found you." He paused. "I looked for a girl with a braid and a kind heart. I did not think to look for a widow who had sworn off kings." Margaret let out a short, humorless laugh. "And now you have found her, and she will not curtsy to you. What will you do with her, your grace? Lock her in a tower, send her back to the Thornwood in disgrace?" "I will do none of those things," William said. He pushed himself off the table and took a step toward her, and for a moment she tensed, ready to step back. But he stopped at a respectful distance, and he looked at her with those tired, careful eyes. "I will ask you to stay," he said. "Not as a subject, not as a supplicant. As a guest of this hall, for as long as you wish, and if you choose to leave tomorrow, I will not stop you. The doors will be unlocked, and you will be free to go." Margaret searched his face for the lie, the trick, the hidden blade that always came with a king's generosity. She found none. He stood there scarred and weary and impossibly patient, and he was not asking her for anything. "Why?" she demanded. "Why would you do that? You do not know me. You do not know what I am capable of. I could be a spy. I could be a thief. I could be—" "You could be," William agreed, "but I do not think you are. I think you are a woman who has been hurt and who has learned to hurt back before anyone can hurt her first. And I think—" He stopped, and something almost like a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I think you are the only person in this kingdom who has looked at me and seen a man, not a crown, that is worth more than 100 curtsies. Maude, Ceridial opened her mouth, closed it. She had been ready for a fight, for a threat, for the cold machinery of royal power. She had not been ready for this. She looked down at her hands, at the calluses and the scars, at the rough wool of her dress that had seen better days. And then she looked up at him, and she asked the question that had been sitting on her tongue since the moment he had winced. "Your knee," she said. "You favor your left leg. When you leaned us at the table, you favored it. What happened to it?" William's expression flickered, surprise, then something guarded, then a reluctant amusement. "You noticed that." I notice everything, Margaret said. It is how I have survived. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, It is an old wound. From the war in the Eastern Pass, 12 years ago. A horse fell on it. It healed poorly, and it aches in the cold. He paused. I do not speak of it. There are not many people I would tell. Why are you telling me? Because you asked, William said simply. And because you did not ask with pity, or with fear, or with the hope that I would owe you something. You asked the way you do everything else, straight on, without flinching. Margaret did not know what to say to that. She stood in the locked hall, under the flickering candles, with the Alpha King of the North looking at her like she was the only honest thing he had seen in years. And she found that the wall she had built around herself had a crack in it. A small one, but a crack nonetheless. She picked up her cup and drank the rest of the wine in one long swallow. Then she set it down, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the door. She reached the heavy oak door and put her hand on the iron handle. Then she stopped. She did not turn around. I will come back. Think tomorrow, she said. Not because you commanded it, not because I owe you anything, but because... She paused, and the words came out softer than she meant them to. Because I would like to know if you are as honest when the sun is up as you are at midnight. She heard him move behind her. She did not turn. I will be here, William said. His voice was low, and there was something in it that she could not name. I have waited 22 years. I can wait until morning. Margaret pulled the door open. The cold air hit her face, sharp and clean, and she stepped through it without looking back. But as she walked down the long corridor, her heart beating faster than it should have, she could not shake the feeling that she had just left something behind in that hall, something she had not meant to give away. Margaret came back to the castle the next morning, just as she had promised. She told herself it was not because of anything William had said in the dark. She told herself she was only curious whether a king who spoke so gently at midnight would remember to be decent when the sun was high and the servants were watching. She did not go to the great hall, she went to the kitchens, because that was where old Nora would be. And old Nora was the only person in this castle who did not look at her like she was a feral dog that had wandered in off the moors. Back already, dearie? Old Nora said, not looking up from the pot she was stirring. The steam rose and curled around her round face, and she smiled. I figured you'd be halfway to the Thornwood by now. I said I'd come back, Margaret said. She sat down on the low stool by the fire, letting the warmth soak into her hands. I keep my word. To a king? That's a first. Old Nora chuckled and ladled something thick and brown into a clay bowl. Here, eat. A full belly makes a soft heart, dearie. Margaret took the bowl. She did not argue. The stew was good, lamb and root vegetables, seasoned with something she could not name. She ate in silence, and old Nora bustled around the kitchen, humming an old song about a shepherd who lost his sheep and found a wife instead. It was the boy who changed everything. He came stumbling through the kitchen door, a thin lad of maybe 10 years, with straw-colored hair and a face flushed red with fever. He was clutching his side and breathing in short, ragged gasps. Old Nora dropped the ladle and was at his side in an instant. Tommy, what's wrong, love? The fever. The boy wheezed. It's back. My side, it hurts. Something awful. Old Nora pressed a hand to his forehead and cursed under her breath. That wound's gone bad. I told that apothecary we needed more of the yarrow paste, but he says the stores are low and the king's accounts are closed for the season. Margaret set down her bowl. There's no yarrow in the castle? Not enough. And the apothecary won't open his stores without a signed order. Says rules are rules. Old Nora's voice was bitter. Rules don't fill a sick boy's belly with medicine. Margaret looked at the boy. Tommy was shivering now, his small body shaking even as the fire blazed. She knew that kind of fever. She had lost a younger brother to it. Years ago, in a winter much like this one, she had watched him shake and burn and finally go still, and no one had been able to do a thing. Not this time. Where does the apothecary keep the yarrow? She asked. Old Nora looked at her, surprised. Locked cabinet in the east tower, keys on his belt. He never lets it out of his sight. Margaret stood up. Then I'll have to ask him nicely. Dearie, you can't just... But Margaret was already walking out the kitchen door, and she did not stop. The apothecary was a thin, pinch-faced man named Brother Aldous, and he was exactly as accommodating as old Nora had suggested. He stood in the doorway of his tower room, arms crossed, and listened to Margaret's request with the expression of a man who had heard every excuse in the world. "The yarrow paste is for the castle's stores," he said flatly. "Not for every servant who comes begging." "The boy is 10 years old and he's burning up with fever," Margaret said. "You have the medicine. He needs it." "I need a signed order from the king or his steward. That is the rule." Margaret looked at him. Then she looked at the locked cabinet behind him and at the key hanging from his belt. She could feel the old fury rising in her chest, the same fury she had felt at the banquet, when every eye in the hall had expected her to bend her knee. She did not bend. She reached out quick as a striking snake and snatched the key from his belt. Brother Aldous yelped and lunged for her, but she was already at the cabinet, turning the lock, pulling open the door. She grabbed a small clay jar labeled with the word yarrow and shoved it into her pocket. "Tell the king," she said, her voice steady. "Tell him Margaret of the Thornwood stole from his apothecary to save a sick boy. I'll be in the kitchen." She was halfway down the tower stairs when she ran into Edmund. The steward stood at the bottom of the steps, his face a mask of cold disapproval. He had clearly been on his way up, and he had clearly heard enough. Behind him, 2 guards shifted uncertainly. "Margaret of the Thornwood," Edmund said, "Aha," and the name came out like a curse. "I heard you were back. I did not expect you to be late."
"Eating the castle stores before midday. The boy is sick," Margaret said. "The medicine was locked up. I unlocked it. You stole from the king. I borrowed from the apothecary." She held his gaze. "I'll pay for it, out of my own pocket if I have to. But the boy needs it now, not after your brother signs a piece of paper." Edmund's jaw tightened. "That is not how things are done here. There is a process. There are rules." "Your rules are going to let that boy die. Be that as it may, is it?" Margaret stepped closer, her voice low and hard. "Is that what you want, on your conscience, steward? A 10-year-old boy, dead because you wouldn't let someone open a cabinet?" Edmund's mouth opened and closed. For a moment the cold mask cracked, and Margaret saw something uncertain behind it. But then he straightened, and the mask was back. "You will answer for this," he said. "I will bring it before the king myself." "Do that," Margaret said, and she walked past him down the stairs and did not look back. She found Tommy in the kitchen, curled on a pallet by the fire. Old Nora had wrapped him in blankets and was pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. The boy's eyes were glassy with fever, and his breath came in shallow, painful gasps. Margaret knelt beside him. She opened the jar and scooped out a generous amount of the thick green paste. "This is going to sting, lad," she said softly, "but it'll help." Tommy whimpered as she spread the paste over the wound on his side, but he did not cry. He bit his lip and squeezed his eyes shut, and Margaret worked quickly, her rough hands gentle despite themselves. When she was done, she wrapped a clean strip of linen around his middle and sat back. "There," she said. "You'll be right as rain in a day or 2. Tommy opened his eyes.
"And be very blue and very tired." "Thank you, miss." "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you're climbing trees again." Old Nora let out a shaky breath. "You're a good soul, Margaret. Stubborn as a mule, but good." "Don't let it get around," Margaret said. "I have a reputation to maintain." It was then that she heard footsteps in the corridor, heavy, measured, the kind of footsteps that came with a crown and a kingdom's worth of weight behind them. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Tommy, smoothing the blanket over his thin shoulders. The footsteps stopped at the kitchen door. "Maggie?" William's voice was quiet. Not angry, not commanding, just quiet. Margaret finally looked up. He was standing in the doorway in his riding clothes, mud splattered on his boots, his gray eyes unreadable. Behind him she could see Edmund, stiff with righteous indignation. "So," Margaret said, "here for the lecture?" William did not answer. He walked past her, past old Nora, and knelt down beside the pallet. He looked at Tommy for a long moment, at the flushed face, the bandaged side, the slow, even breathing that had finally settled into something peaceful. Then he looked at Margaret. "You stole from my apothecary," he said. "I did." "You didn't ask permission?" "No point. Your steward would have said no."
William looked at Edmund. His brother shifted uncomfortably. She broke the rules, William. She took a key off Brother Aldous' belt and opened a locked cabinet. If we let that stand, if we let a 10-year-old boy die because of a locked cabinet, William said, his voice still quiet, then we are not the kind of kingdom I want to rule. Edmund fell silent. Williams did it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, which he tossed to Brother Aldous, who had just appeared in the doorway, pale and flustered. That covers the yarrow, and a week's worth of honey for the boy's tea. Brother Aldous caught the pouch, blinking. Your Grace, next time, William said. If a child is sick and a locked cabinet is the only thing standing between him and medicine, you open the cabinet. Do you understand? Yes, Your Grace. William turned back to Margaret. For a long moment they simply looked at each other across the kitchen, a king who had just bent a rule to save a servant's child, and a woman who had broken it without a second thought. There's something I want to show you, William said. When you're done here... Margaret hesitated. She looked at Tommy, who had drifted into a feverish sleep, his face peaceful for the first time in hours. Old Nora shooed her away with a wave of her hand. Go on, dearie, I'll watch the boy. You go see what the king wants. Margaret wiped her hands on her skirt and stood. She followed William out of the kitchen, through a narrow service corridor, past a row of empty storerooms, to a heavy oak door at the far end of the castle. The door was weathered and grey, and it had not been opened in a long time. William produced a key and turned the lock. The door swung open onto a small walled garden. It was a ruin. Dead vines climbed the stone walls. The paths were choked with weeds. In the center, where a fountain must once have stood, there was now only a cracked stone basin filled with brown, stagnant water. But against the far wall, half hidden by frost and dead leaves, there was a rosebush. One single rosebush. Bare, brittle, frozen. Margaret walked toward it without thinking. She knelt and touched one of the stems. It was dead, or nearly so. The wood was dark and dry, and the roots were barely clinging to the frozen earth. This garden belonged to my first wife, William said from behind her. She planted that rose the spring before she died. It has not bloomed in 12 years. Margaret looked up at him. His face was unreadable, but his hands hanging at his sides were clenched into fists. Why are you showing me this? William was silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, Because you saved that boy without waiting for permission. Because you looked at a rule that was killing someone and decided it was the rule that was wrong. He paused. She was the only person who ever looked at me like that. Like I was a man, not a crown, Margaret said.
Nothing. She looked back at the frozen rose bush, at the dead stems and the frozen earth, and she felt something twist in her chest, something she did not want to name.
I'll see what I can do about this, she said, and her voice came out rougher than she meant it to. The bush. It might still be alive. Roots can survive a lot if you give them time. William looked at her. For a moment something crossed his face, something raw and unguarded like the look he had worn at midnight in the great hall. Then he nodded. Thank you, Maggie. She stood up and brushed the frost from her hands. Don't thank me yet. It might be dead. It's not dead, William said. It's just been waiting for someone to bother. He turned and walked back through the garden door, leaving her alone with the frozen rosebush and the strange, warm ache spreading through her chest. She looked at the dead stems, and for the first time since she had walked into that banquet hall, she thought about staying. The frost came down hard that week, harder than anyone in the castle could remember. The river froze over in 3 nights, and the mill wheel stopped turning with a groan that old Nora swore she could hear from the kitchen window. By the 5th morning, the grain stores had been measured twice, and both times the steward came away with a face like a man who had just watched his own coffin being measured. Maggie heard about it in the kitchen, where she had taken to eating her breakfast standing up, with one eye on the door and the other on the pot of porridge old Nora kept shoving toward her. They say the roads are already white past the 2nd bridge, old Nora said, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon the size of a small oar. And the village granary's down to half. Half, dearie. In a winter like this...
That's not a granary, that's a promise of grief. Maggie said nothing. She had grown up in a house where grain was counted the way other people counted their children. By name, by need, by the fear of what would happen when it ran out. She knew what a half-full granary meant in a hard winter. It meant choosing which children ate. It meant the old ones going without so the young ones could see the spring. "And the king?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Old Nora glanced toward the door, then leaned in. "He's been in the war room since before dawn, with Master Edmund and the granary keeper and that sour-faced fellow from the mill. They're saying he means to commandeer the village stores, pull everything into the castle, and ration it out." "Commandeer the village stores?" Maggie set her mug down hard enough that the table jumped. "That's not a plan. That's a robbery with a crown on it." Old Nora gave her a long, knowing look. "Careful, dearie. Walls have ears, and some of those ears are attached to Master Edmund." Maggie took a breath, counted to 5, and let it out. She had promised herself, after the night in the great hall and the stolen medicine and the frozen rose bush, that she would not go looking for fights. But this was not a fight about curtsies. This was about children going hungry while a king sat in a warm room and decided which of them would eat. She found William where old Nora said he would be, in the war room, hunched over a map of the valley with his brothers and the granary keeper. The door was open and she walked straight in without knocking, which was the sort of thing that made Edmund's jaw tighten like a vice. "Your Grace," she said, and the title came out like a stone dropped into still water. "I hear you're planning to strip the village granary and hoard the grain behind castle walls." Silence. The granary keeper stared at her as if she had walked in wearing a crown. Edmund's hand went to the hilt of his dagger. "But William—" William just straightened up slowly, and there was something in his gray eyes that was not anger. It looked almost like relief. "Word travels fast," he said. "Word travels through the kitchen," Maggie corrected. "And the kitchen doesn't have a good opinion of your plan." "I didn't realize the kitchen had opinions." "The kitchen has all the opinions, Your Grace. The kitchen just doesn't always say them to your face." "I'm saying them to your face." Edmund stepped forward, his voice sharp as a blade. "This is the war room, widow. You have no seat here, no voice, and no right to speak to the king in such a manner. I'll have you escorted." "Stand down, Edmund." William's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a winter wind. "She's not wrong to question the plan. I don't like it either." Edmund's mouth opened and closed. "Brother," I said, "stand down." The room fell still. The granary keeper shuffled his feet. The sour-faced man from the mill studied the ceiling as if it held the secrets of the harvest. Maggie stood her ground, her hands folded in front of her, her chin up. William turned back to the map. "The village granary is half full. The castle stores are at 2/3. If I pull the village grain into the castle, I can feed everyone, but I have to ration, and rationing means some people go without. The old, the weak, the ones who can't work their share. I don't like that arithmetic." "Then don't do it," Maggie said. "Then what do you suggest? Let the village starve so I can keep my own cellars full?" "I won't be that kind of king." Maggie took a step closer, and for the first time, As she had walked into the banquet hall, she spoke to him not as a rival or an enemy or a woman guarding her pride, but as someone who had seen a thing he had not. "The Thornwood pack has a storehouse," she said, "hidden in the old hunting lodge 1/2 a day's ride west. My husband's brother Malcolm thinks it's empty. It's not. There's enough grain there to feed this valley for 3 months, maybe 4 if the winter doesn't stretch too long." William's eyes narrowed. "Your husband's brother, the man who's been calling you a traitor." "The same. He doesn't know about the storehouse. I kept the ledger when I left, and I never told him where it was. I was saving it, I don't know, for something, for someone who'd use it better than he would." She paused, and her voice dropped. "I'll give it to you. The grain, the location, the ledger, all of it, on one condition." "What condition?" "You don't strip the village dry. You use my grain first, and you keep the village granaries whole for the planting season. Because if you take all the seed corn, there won't be a harvest next year. And I didn't survive a hard winter to watch this valley die of a summer that never came." The room was silent. Even Edmund had stopped bristling, though his hand was still on his dagger. The granary keeper was staring at Maggie as if she had just pulled a miracle out of her apron pocket. William looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something that made Edmund's jaw drop. He walked around the table, pulled out a chair, and set it in front of her. "Sit down, Maggie. Tell me about this storehouse." She sat, and for the first time, the two of them leaned over a map together. not as supplicant and king, but as two people who were trying to solve the same problem. William asked about the road to the lodge, the condition of the grain, how much could be moved in a single sled. Maggie answered in short, practical sentences, her finger tracing the deer paths on the map, her voice steady and calm. Edmund watched from the corner, his expression a shifting storm of disapproval and reluctant curiosity. The granary keeper made notes. The sour-faced man from the mill, who had not said a word the whole time, finally spoke up. "If the widow's grain is as good as she says, we might not need to touch the village stores at all until Plenton." William looked up. His gray eyes met Maggie's, and there was something in them she had not seen there before, something that looked a little like trust. "Then we'll do it her way," he said. The meeting broke up shortly after. Edmund left without a word, his boots heavy against the stone floor. The granary keeper hurried off to crack the wax seal on the castle's grain records. The sour-faced man from the mill shuffled out muttering something about sleds and oxen. Maggie stayed in her chair, watching William fold the map with careful, deliberate hands. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Take my word like that. In front of all of them?" William was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You stole medicine for a servant boy because you thought he was going to die. You told me the rose bush might still be alive because you hoped it was. And now, you've handed me your family's secret storehouse, the one thing you had left, because you'd rather feed a valley than keep a grudge." He looked up. "I'd be a fool not to take your word, Maggie. You're the only person in this castle who hasn't tried to sell me something." She opened her mouth to argue, to deflect, to say something rough and dismissive, but nothing came out. So she stood up, brushed teeth and dust from her skirt, and said the only true thing she could think of. "Don't make me regret it, that's all." "I won't," William said, and the way he said it made her chest feel tight in a way she did not want to examine. The next few days were a blur of movement. Sleds were loaded, oxen hitched, and a small party rode west toward the old hunting lodge at dawn, with Maggie sitting on the lead sled, wrapped in a borrowed cloak 2 sizes too big, her breath fogging the air as she called directions to the driver. The grain was there, exactly as she had said, row after row of sacks, dry and good, enough to feed a valley through the worst of the winter. By the time the last sled rolled back through the castle gates, the village granaries were untouched, and the castle stores were full to bursting. Old Nora made a pie in celebration, a ridiculous, wasteful, glorious pie with dried apples and honey and a crust like a golden shield, and she pressed the first slice into Maggie's hands before anyone else could reach for it. "Eat, dearie," she said. "A full belly makes a soft heart." Maggie ate, and she did not admit, even to herself, that the pie tasted better than any meal she had eaten in years. On the evening of the 3rd day, William summoned the whole castle, servants, guards, kitchen maids, the granary keeper, even Edmund, who stood at the back with his arms crossed and his mouth set in a thin line. They gathered in the great hall, the same hall where Maggie had once refused to curtsy, and William stood at the head of the table, his voice carrying to every corner. "This winter will be hard," he said, "but it will not be a famine. We have great enough, because one person chose to give instead of hoard. Margaret of the Thornwood pack has offered her family's storehouse to feed Just Valley. In return, I name her the castle's grain advisor for the season, with full voice in all matters of food and supply." Maggie froze. She had not asked for a title. She had not wanted a title. She had wanted to help, and then she had wanted to leave, quietly before anyone could start expecting things from her. But William looked at her across the hall, and there was a challenge in his gray eyes, warm and steady. "You said you wouldn't bow to anyone who hadn't earned it," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Fair enough. I'm not asking you to bow. I'm asking you to stay." The hall erupted in murmurs. Edmund's face went dark, but Maggie heard none of it. She was looking at William, and William was looking at her, and something in her chest was cracking open, slow and warm, like ice giving way to the first light of spring. She did not answer. She could not answer. She just stood there, in the hall where she had once refused to curtsy, and felt the weight of a door that was no longer trying to close her out. The snow began on the 5th morning after the granary was opened, and it did not stop for 2 days. Maggie told herself she was not thinking about what William had said in the great hall. She told herself she was not thinking about the way his gray eyes had held hers, warm and steady, when he said, "I'm not asking you to bow. I'm asking you to stay." She had not answered him then. She had not answered him in the 3 days since, either, though she had taken her meals in the kitchen with Aunt Nora and pretended not to notice that a place was always set for her at the high table. She was not thinking about it. She was thinking about the granary. The grain from the old hunting lodge had filled the castle stores, but the village granary at the edge of the Thornwood was another matter. The roof had been leaking for weeks, and Maggie had given her word to the village elders that she would see it mended before the worst of the winter. She had given her word. That was the thing she did not break, even when everything else in her life was held together with stubbornness and spite. So when the snow let up on the evening of the second day, she pulled her wool cloak tight, tucked her braid into her collar, and slipped out of the castle by the kitchen door. Old Nora had tried to stop her, waving a ladle and muttering about women with more courage than sense, but Maggie had only grinned and said, "If I'm not back by morning, send the king to fetch me. He owes me a favor." She did not know, as she walked the half-mile to the village, that William was standing at the window of his study, watching her small figure disappear into the white. The roof was worse than she remembered. A whole section of the thatch had collapsed inward, and the grain sacks beneath it were wet and beginning to sprout. Maggie cursed under her breath and set to work, dragging the dry sacks to the far corner, stacking them on a raised platform of old boards she found in the shed. She worked until her fingers were numb and her back ached, and by the time she had done what she could, the light was almost gone and the wind had picked up again. She should have gone back then. She knew she should have gone back, but there was a sound, a low, creaking groan from the roof, and then a crack that split the silence like a bone breaking. A beam gave way and a cascade of snow and thatch came down on her before she could move, knocking her off her feet and through the rotted floorboards at the back of the granary. She fell into freezing water. The stream that ran behind the thing. The village had been hidden under the snow, and the granary had been built over it, generations ago when someone had thought it clever to have water close by. The boards had rotted through, and now the cold took her like a fist. She gasped, swallowed a mouthful of icy water, and went under. Maggie was not a woman who panicked. She had been cold before. She had been afraid before. But the water was so cold it stole the breath from her lungs and the strength from her limbs, and for a long, terrible moment she could not remember which way was up. She kicked, found the broken edge of the floorboards, and dragged herself up, gasping, chest heaving, fingers bleeding from the splintered wood. She was alive. She was alive. And she was soaked to the bone, and the snow was falling so thick she could not see 3 feet in front of her. She tried to climb out, but her hands were too numb to grip, and her boots were full of water, and the bank of the stream was slick with ice. She tried again, and then she stopped trying, because her arms would not lift anymore, and the cold was not a pain anymore. It was a heaviness, a sleepiness, a voice that said, soft and gentle, "Rest now, rest." She was still fighting it when she heard the horse. She thought she was dreaming. A horse, in this storm, on this night? But the sound came closer, and then there was a shout, a man's voice, hoarse and desperate, calling her name. "Margaret!" She tried to answer, but her throat would not work. She heard the horse stumble, a cry of pain that was not hers, and then the sound of a body hitting the snow. And then there were hands on her. Strong hands, cold hands, pulling her up out of the water, wrapping something warm around her, holding her against a chest that was heaving with exertion. "Marga." "Ramouths." "Margaret, look at me." She looked up. William's face was white with cold and pain, and there was a gash on his temple where he had struck the ice. His left leg was twisted underneath him at an angle it should not have been, and she could see, even through the snow, that he was hurt badly. "You fell," she whispered, her voice cracked and useless. "You fell off your horse." "I fell because I was too busy looking at you," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost angry, almost desperate. "You stubborn, foolish women, what were you doing out here alone?" "Mending the roof," she said. He laughed, a short, ragged laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. "Of course you were. Of course you were mending the roof in a blizzard." He shifted, trying to stand, and his leg buckled under him. He bit down hard, and the sound he made was not quite a scream, but it was close. "William," she said his name without thinking, her hand reaching for his leg. "You cannot walk on that." "I am not leaving you here," he said. "You will not leave either of us here if you break your leg completely," she said, and her voice was sharp, sharp with fear, sharp with the thing she would not name. "We have to get to the village. There's a house, the miller's house. He has a stove, he has food. We can you walk?" She tested her legs. They were shaking, but they held. "Yes. Then we walk." She did not argue. She pulled his arm over her shoulder, and he leaned on her, and they walked through the snow, one slow, agonizing step at a time. He was heavier than she had expected, and he was trying to hide how much it cost him, but she could feel his whole body shaking, and she could hear the breath hissing through his teeth with every step. They made it to the miller's house, the mere.
Liller was an old man named Hob, and he took one look at the king of the Thornwood, bleeding and half frozen, and did not ask a single question. He stoked the fire, brought blankets and hot water and a bottle of something strong that smelled like potatoes and burned like the devil. He helped them get William onto the bed by the stove, and then he looked at Maggie and said quietly, "I'll boil some water. You tend to him. I'll be in the other room if you need me." Maggie nodded. She did not know what to say to him, this man who had just taken in a king and a stranger in a blizzard without a word of complaint. She wanted to thank him, but the words would not come, so she just nodded, and he seemed to understand. She knelt by the bed and looked at William. His left leg was a mess. The boot had to be cut off with Hobb's knife, and beneath it the knee was swollen to twice its size, purple and black and wrong. His ankle was twisted, and there was a deep gash on his shin where the horse's hoof had caught him. He watched her work with his jaw clenched, his gray eyes bright with pain, and he did not make a sound. "I have to set it," she said. "The knee. It's out of joint." "I know. It's going to hurt." "I know." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and there was a moment of something that was not quite a smile, but was close. "You can scream if you need to," she said. "There's no one here to judge you." "I never scream," he said. "Well, then you can bite this." She shoved the corner of a folded blanket between his teeth, and he looked at her with an expression that was almost amused, almost annoyed, and then she took his knee in both hands and set it. He did not scream, but the blanket came out of his mouth with tooth marks in it, and his face was white as the snow outside.
And there was sweat on his forehead that had nothing to do with the heat of the stove. "Good," she said, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. "You'll live." "I never doubted it," he said, and his voice was thin, but there was a thread of humor in it. "You have very strong hands for a woman who claims she doesn't care about anyone." "Shut up," she said, but there was no heat in it. She was pressing a cloth to the gash on his shin, and her hands were shaking, and the tears she had been holding back for the last hour were burning behind her eyes. He saw, of course he saw. "Margaret, don't!" She said it sharply, too sharply. "Don't you dare, Margaret." He reached out and caught her wrist, and his grip was weak, but it was there. "I'm all right. Look at me. I'm all right." "You fell off a horse in a blizzard because you were too busy trying to save me," she said, and her voice cracked. "You could have died. You could have... Your leg, William, your leg was... But I didn't die," he said, "and my leg will heal. And you are here, and I am here, and that is what matters." She looked at him, and something in her chest cracked open, slow and warm, like ice giving way to the first light of spring. She wanted to say something sharp, something defensive, something that would push him away before he could get any closer, but the words would not come. "I was so scared," she whispered, and it was the truest thing she had said to anyone in years. "When I fell in the water, I thought, he doesn't even know I'm gone. No one knows I'm gone. And I was so scared, and I thought..." She stopped. She could not say the rest. She could not say, "I thought I would never see you again, and that scared me more than drowning." But he heard it anyway. He always heard it. "Margaret," he said, and his voice was soft, softer than she had ever heard it. "I will always know when you're gone." She did not answer. She could not answer. She just sat there, holding his hand, watching the firelight move across his face, and she did not let go. She stayed there all night. She changed the cloths on his shin. She kept the fire stoked. She made him drink water and the potato spirits, and tried not to think about the way his hand kept finding hers in the dark. Hob came in once, offered soup, and left again.
and she did not know if it was midnight or dawn or somewhere in between. And then, near morning, William stirred. He had been sleeping, or half-sleeping, drifting in and out of pain, and he began to mutter, low and restless, turning his hat on the pillow. She leaned closer, thinking he was in pain, thinking she should wake him. "Eleanor," he said. The name was soft and broken and full of something that made Maggie's heart stop. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Eleanor." Maggie's hand froze on his. She stared down at him, at this man who had locked her in a ballroom, who had given her a key to a dead woman's garden, who had told her, in front of the whole castle, that he was not asking her to bow. He was asking her to stay, and now he was whispering another woman's name in his sleep, and his face was twisted with a grief she had never seen on a living face before. She did not move, she did not speak, she just sat there, holding his hand, and listened to him whisper his sorrow to a name that was not hers. When he woke, an hour later, she was still holding his hand. He looked at her, and there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Embarrassment, maybe, or memory. But he did not say anything about it. He just looked at her, and she looked at him. And the silence between them was full of a name neither of them would speak.
"We should get you back to the castle," she said, and her voice was steady, because she had spent her whole life learning how to steady her voice. "Your leg needs a proper healer." He nodded. "And you need a proper bath. You smell like a drowned sheep." She laughed. It was a small, surprised laugh, and it came out of her before she could stop it. "And you smell like a dying horse. We're even." He smiled, and it was the first real smile she had seen on his face, and it made the pain in her chest worse instead of better. They made it back to the castle on a sled, hob rigged up, and the healer was called and the lead was set properly in a splint, and all the while Maggie stayed close, telling herself it was because she had given her word, telling herself it was because she owed him, telling herself all the things she told herself to keep from admitting the truth. She had heard a name that was not hers on his lips, and she did not know what it meant, but she knew with a certainty that settled into her bones like the cold of that river that she would not be leaving this castle. Not yet. Maybe not ever. 3 days after the storm, the snow had stopped falling, but the cold had settled into the ground like a thing that meant to stay. Maggie woke before dawn, as she always did, and lay still in the narrow bed in the healer's loft, listening to the sounds of the castle stirring below. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the low murmur of the kitchen fire catching. Somewhere a dog barked, and she thought of William, and then she thought of the name he'd whispered in the dark, and she pushed the covers back and got up. She did not ask him about Eleanor. She told herself it was not her place, told herself he had been half out of his mind with fever and pain, told herself all the reasonable things a woman tells herself when she is afraid of the answer, and William, for his part, did not offer. He had been propped up in his chambers since the healer set his leg, and whenever she came to check the splint or change the linens, he looked at her with those gray eyes that seemed to see straight through her, and he said nothing. So they moved around each other like two people sharing a narrow path, careful, polite, and full of things unsaid. On the third morning she was in the kitchen helping old Nora roll out dough for the morning bread when a horn sounded from the watchtower. It was not the short, sharp blast that meant a messenger. It was the long, low call that meant riders approaching in force. And it went on until old Nora's hands stopped moving and the flour hung in the air like a held breath. "Who is it?" Maggie asked, though her voice had gone thin. Old Nora wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the narrow window that faced the gate. "Thornwood colors," she said quietly. "Red and black. That's your people, dearie." Maggie's blood went cold. She walked to the window and looked out, and there they were. A column of riders in red and black cloaks, their horses blowing steam into the frozen morning air. At their head rode a man she had not seen in 6 years. A man with the same dark hair as her dead husband, the same broad shoulders, the same hard mouth that had never once smiled at her. Malcolm, her brother-in-law, the man who had stood at her husband's funeral and called her a widow, and then, in the same breath, called her a liability. "He's come for me," she said. Old Nora made a small sound in her throat. "He can't just take you. You're under the king." Thing were nerf. I'm under his roof, Maggie said slowly. But I'm not under his protection, not unless he says so. She turned from the window, and the dough was still on the table, and the fire was still burning, and somewhere in the castle, a door slammed with a sound like a verdict. By the time she reached the great hall, the riders had dismounted, and Malcolm was standing in the middle of the flags, mud on his boots, snow melting off his cloak, and his eyes found her the moment she came through the door. "Margaret," he said. Not sister, not Maggie, just her name, flat and hard like a stone dropped into a still pool. "Malcolm." She kept her voice even, kept her chin up, kept her hands still at her sides, even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "You're a long way from Thornwood. I'm here to take you home. I'm not going home." "You are." He took a step toward her, and the guards on either side of the hall shifted, but no one moved to stop him. "You're a Thornwood widow, bound by bloodline and by law to your husband's clan. You left without leave, without word, 6 years ago. You've been hiding in this castle, under this king's roof, and I've come to bring you back." "I didn't hide," she said. "I walked out of that hall the day after the funeral, and no one stopped me, because no one cared to. You made that clear enough." Malcolm's mouth tightened. "You were grieving. We made allowances." "Allowances." She laughed, and it was an ugly, hollow sound. "You made allowances for me the way you make allowances for a lame horse. You were going to marry me off to your cousin Joffrey the moment my mourning year was up. Don't stand there and pretend you came all this way out of brotherly love." The hall had gone very quiet. The castle folk who had gathered to watch were pressing back against the walls, and Maggie could feel their eyes on her, could feel the weight of their curiosity and their fear, and she wanted to scream at all of them to go away. Then she heard it. The slow, uneven rhythm of a boot and a cane on the stone floor. William came down the stairs from his chambers, one hand gripping the carved banister, the other leaning on a plain wooden cane the healer had cut for him. His left leg was splinted and bandaged, and every step cost him something, but he did not hurry, and he did not look away from Malcolm. "Malco of Thornwood," he said, and his voice was low and cold and carried all the way to the rafters. "You are in my hall. Uninvited, with armed men at my gate. State your business, or leave." Malcolm turned and gave a shallow bow that was barely a nod. "Your Grace, I've come for my brother's widow. She's a Thornwood woman, and she belongs with her people." "She belongs where she chooses to stand," William said, "and I haven't heard her say she wants to go with you." "She's a woman," Malcolm said, as if that settled it. "She doesn't get to choose." William's jaw tightened. He took another step down, and Maggie saw his knuckles go white around the cane. "In my hall she does. Say what you came to say, and then get off my land." Malcolm's eyes flicked to Maggie, and there was something in them she had not seen before. Not anger, not contempt, but something older and colder. Fear. "Fine," he said. "Then I'll say it plainly. This woman abandoned her husband's clan, took nothing but a pack of clothes and her dead husband's signet ring, and ran. She swore no oath of fealty to any king, and she's been living under your roof for months, eating your bread, taking your protection, while her own people starve in the hills." "Mag, go on once still." "What do you mean, starve?" "The winter came early," Malcolm said, and for a moment he didn't sound like the hard, cold man she remembered. He sounded tired. "The old grain stores were already thin before the snow fell. Half the village has been eating roots and boiled bark for a month. And you sit here in this castle, warm and fed, and you call yourself a Thornwood woman?" The words landed like blows, and Maggie felt them each one. She thought of the village she had grown up in, of the children who used to run barefoot through the summer grass, of the old women who had taught her to weave. She had left them. She had told herself she was saving herself, that she couldn't save them by staying, that her husband's clan had made it clear she was a burden, not a blessing. But she had left them all the same. "I didn't know," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "You didn't want to know," Malcolm said. "Enough!" Willen's voice cut through the air like a blade. He reached to the bottom of the stairs now, and he stood between Maggie and Malcolm, his weight braced on the cane, his gray eyes hard as winter ice. "You've said your piece. Now hear mine. This woman is under my protection. She has been since the night she walked into my hall and refused to curtsy, and she will remain under it for as long as she chooses to stay. If your people are starving, that is a grief I share,
and a problem we can discuss. But you will not take her from my land by force, and you will not speak to her as if she were a piece of livestock. Is that clear?" Malcolm stared at him for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "You're protecting a woman who refused to bend the knee to you. What kind of king does that? The kind who's tired of people bowing out?"
"Of fear," William said. The words hung in the air, and Maggie felt something crack open in her chest, something she had been holding shut for years. She stepped forward, past William, past the guards, until she was standing face to face with Malcolm in the middle of the hall. "You want to know why I left?" she said. "You want to know why I refused to bow to any king, to this king, to anyone? Because I watched my husband, your brother, bow. I watched him bend his knee to your old king over and over every time the man demanded it. He bowed for grain, he bowed for coin, he bowed for the right to keep his own people from starving. And the more he bowed, the more the king took, until there was nothing left to take. And then the king sent him to fight in a war that wasn't ours, and he died in a muddy field for a man who never once called him by name." Her voice was shaking, but she did not stop. "I watched him die for his courtesy. I watched him die for his bowing. And I swore, standing over his grave, that I would never bend my knee to another man who thought my dignity was his to trade. So no, Malcolm. I didn't run from my people. I ran from the thing that killed your brother, the thing that's been killing our people for generations, and I will not go back to it. Not for you, not for anyone." The hall was silent. Even the guards had stopped shifting their weight, stopped breathing, it seemed. Malcolm looked at her for a long time, and something in his face shifted, a crack in the hard stone of it. Then he looked away, at the floor, at the snow melting off his boots, and he said, "You always were too proud for your own good, Margaret." "Too proud to die the way he did," she said. "Yes, I am." Malcolm turned and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped, and his voice turned. Ice carried back into the hall flat and final. 3 days, he said. "I'll give you 3 days to change your mind and come with me peacefully. After that, I'll have no choice but to treat your refusal as an act of defiance against Thornwood law, and I'll come back with more than 50 riders." The door slammed behind him, and the sound of it echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Maggie stood in the middle of the empty floor, her hands shaking, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. She heard the guards murmur, heard the castle folk begin to drift away, heard old Nora's soft footsteps as she came to stand beside her. "Dearie," old Nora said gently, "come sit down. You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's worse than a ghost," Maggie said. "It's a future, and I don't know how to survive it." She turned, and William was still standing at the bottom of the stairs, leaning on his cane, watching her with those gray eyes. He had not moved the whole time she was speaking. He had not interrupted, had not defended her, had not tried to soften what she said. He had just stood there and let her speak. And something about that, the simple, steady weight of his attention, made her want to cry. "I didn't mean to say all that," she said, her voice rough. "I didn't mean to." "You meant every word of it," William said quietly, "and you needed to say it. I'm glad you said it here, where it was safe." "Safe," she laughed, a broken sound. "Your hall isn't safe. Your brother wants me gone. Your council thinks I'm a bad influence, and now my own family is camped outside your gates, threatening to come back with an army. Safe is the last thing this is." William took a step toward her, and then another, and the cane tapped against the stones with each step until he was standing close Eno. That she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the way his jaw worked when he was trying to find the right words. "Maggie," he said, and it was the first time he had ever used her name, just her name, without the "of Thornwood," without the formality, and it made her breath catch. "You said you were afraid of losing me. Do you remember that?" She swallowed. "You were feverish. You might not remember." "I remember everything." His voice was low and rough. "I remember you in that mill, with your hands on me, telling me to stay with you. I remember the sound of your voice when you said you were afraid, and I remember that I woke up and you were still there, and I thought maybe I'd finally found something worth keeping." He reached out slowly and took her hand. His fingers were warm and calloused, and his grip was careful, as if he were holding something fragile. "If Malcolm comes back with his army," William said, "I will stand between him and you. I will stand in front of your gates, on this leg or not, and I will tell him that you are not his to take. And if that means war, then it means war. But I will not give you back to the people who made you swear never to bend your knee." Maggie looked at him, at the gray eyes and the tired face and the hand holding hers, and she felt the thing in her chest crack open a little wider. "You barely know me," she whispered. "Why would you do that for me?" William smiled, a small, tired smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Because you're the only person in this kingdom who looked at me and didn't see a crown. You saw a man, and I've been waiting a long time for someone to see that. I'm not letting it go now." He squeezed her hand, then let go, and turned to walk back toward the stairs. The cane tapped against the stones, and Maggie stood in the middle of the empty hall watching him go, and she thought of the name he had whispered in the dark, Eleanor, and she thought of all the things he had not told her, and all the things she had not told him. 3 days, Malcolm had said. 3 days, and then either she went back to the people who had broken her, or William went to war for her, and somewhere in the back of her mind a small, stubborn voice whispered, He would go to war for you. She did not know if that made her feel safe or terrified. 7. Malcolm, William, Eleanor. The morning after Malcolm rode away, the castle woke to a silence that felt heavier than the storm had been. The gates were barred, the watch doubled, and every servant who crossed the courtyard did so with quick, worried steps. No one said the word war, but it hung in the air like the smell of smoke before a fire. Maggie found Edmund in the great hall before the morning meal was even laid. He stood at the long oak table, unrolling a map of the Thornwood border, his jaws set in that particular way that meant he had been arguing with his brother again. "The stores are sufficient for 8 weeks, he said without looking up. "If we ration, if the spring comes early, if—" He stopped, and his fingers pressed flat against the map. "This is not about grain, and you know it." "I know it." Maggie walked to the table and set her hands on its edge. "Your brother made a choice. I did not ask him to make it." "No." Edmund finally looked at her, and there was something tired in his gray eyes, the same gray as William's, but without the warmth. "You did not ask. That is precisely the trouble. He has chosen to protect a woman who refuses to bend, and the clans will see it as weakness. They will say, Dodge, Think Alpha King has been softened by a widow's stubborn pride." "Let them say it." Maggie's voice was quiet. "I have been called worse." Edmund's mouth tightened. He rolled up the map with more force than necessary and turned toward the door, but paused at the threshold. "I do not wish you ill, Margaret of Thornwood. But I wish my brother had never met you. He was harder before you came. Harder and safer." He left before she could answer, and Maggie stood alone in the great hall, listening to the echoes of his boots on the stone. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to tell him that his brother had been lonely long before she arrived, that William had been starving for something no amount of wine or conquest could fill. But she had no proof, only the memory of a crown-tired man who fed stray dogs and whispered a dead woman's name in the dark. So she said nothing, and she went to find work. The grain storehouse was a low stone building near the kitchens, and it had not been properly tended in years. Maggie spent the morning there with 2 servants and a young stable boy named Tom, sweeping out the old husks, checking the barrels for rot, and teaching them how to layer the sacks so the air could move between them. Tom was maybe 12, with a gap-toothed grin and a habit of asking questions faster than she could answer them. "Will the soldiers come, mistress?" he asked, hoisting a sack of barley onto his thin shoulder. Maggie paused. She looked at the boy's earnest face, at the way his fingers gripped the sack like it was the most important thing in the world. "I don't know, Tom," she said honestly. "But whether they come or not, we'll be ready. And being ready is better than being afraid." Tom nodded, as if that settled it, and went back to stacking. Maggie watched him for a moment, and she thought of all the children she had seen in her life, children who had lost fathers to foolish wars, children who had watched their mothers weep over empty pots. She had sworn once that she would never again be part of a world that did that to its young, and yet here she was, in a castle that might soon be at war, teaching a boy how to stack grain. The thought sat heavy in her chest, but she kept working. By midday, word had spread that the Alpha King's new advisor was in the storehouse, and a small crowd of servants had gathered to watch. Some helped, some just watched. Old Nora arrived with a tray of bread and hot soup, clucking her tongue at the dust on Maggie's dress. "You'll ruin your hands, dearie," the cook said, setting the tray on a barrel. "A lady of your standing shouldn't be hauling grain." "I'm not a lady," Maggie said, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "I'm a widow, with a strong back and a stubborn streak, and these hands have done worse than haul grain." Nora clicked her tongue again, but there was a fondness in her eyes. "That's what I told His Majesty when he came asking about you this morning." Maggie stopped. "He came asking about me? Asked if you'd eaten, asked if you'd slept." Nora's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Asked if anyone had given you trouble. I told him the only trouble you'd had was a sack of barley that tried to sit on you, and he laughed. Actually laughed, dearie. I haven't heard that sound in years." Maggie did not know what to say to that. She picked up a piece of bread and tore it in half. Not because she was hungry, but because she needed something to do with her hands. "He should be resting," she said finally. "His knee, he's been up since before dawn, limping through the armory and the
"Fight, which towers?" Nora shook her head. "That man will work himself into an early grave if someone doesn't slow him down, and I don't think he'll listen to anyone but you." The words hung in the air between them. Maggie opened her mouth to deny it, to say that William didn't listen to her, that he only tolerated her because she was inconvenient to dismiss, but the denial died on her tongue, because she knew, in a way she could not explain, that Nora was right. William had listened to her. He had listened to her in the great hall, in the sick room, in the snow. He had listened to her the way no one had listened to her in years. "Someone should slow him down," Maggie said quietly. "But I'm not sure it should be me." Nora patted her arm. "A full belly makes a soft heart, dearie, and that man's been hungry for a long, long time. You're the first person in years who's offered him something that isn't a bargain." The cook picked up her tray and bustled away before Maggie could answer, leaving her standing in the dusty storehouse with a piece of bread in her hand and a strange, unwelcome warmth spreading through her chest. That afternoon, Maggie did something she had not planned to do. She went to the armory. It was a long, low building behind the great hall, and the smiths were busy at their forges, hammering out arrowheads and reinforcing shield straps. The air was thick with the smell of hot iron and sweat. Maggie found William in the far corner, bent over a workbench with a map spread out before him, his cane propped against the table. He was so focused that he did not hear her approach. "You should be resting," she said. He looked up, and for a moment there was something unguarded in his face, a flicker of surprise, then something softer. "And you should be in the storehouse, tea, and think for ourselves how to stack grain." "So you heard about that?" "I hear about everything that happens in my castle." He straightened, and a wince crossed his face as he put weight on his left leg. "It seems you've made quite an impression." "My steward tells me the stores are in better order than they've been in years. My cook tells me you've been feeding the watch. My brother tells me—" He paused, and a dry smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "My brother tells me you're a menace." Maggie felt the corner of her own mouth twitch. "Your brother has good instincts." "He does." William's smile faded. "He also thinks I'm making a mistake, keeping you here, defying the clans." "He's not wrong to worry." Maggie stepped closer to the workbench, looking down at the map. It was a detailed drawing of the Thornwood border, with the castle at its center and the roads leading out marked in red. "You have a kingdom to protect. A war with Malcolm could cost you everything." "I know what it could cost." William's voice was quiet. "I've counted the cost every night for the past 3 days, and I've decided I'm willing to pay it." Maggie looked up at him, and she saw something she had not seen before. Not arrogance, not stubbornness, but a quiet, settled certainty. The certainty of a man who had made his choice and was not going to second-guess it. "Why?" she asked, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Why would you risk everything for someone who won't even curtsy to you?" William was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out, and with the tips of his fingers, he touched the old scar above her left eyebrow, the one she had carried since childhood.
His touch was light, almost reverent. "Because you're the first person in 20 years who looked at me and didn't see a king," he said. "You saw a man with a bad knee and a dead wife and a crown that weighs more than any crown should, and you didn't flinch. You didn't bow. You just looked at me, and you saw me." He let his hand drop. "I've waited a long time for someone to see me like that, Maggie. I'm not letting it go now." She should have said something. She should have told him that he was being foolish, that she was not worth a war, that he was projecting onto her a kindness she did not deserve. But the words would not come. Instead, she stood there in the dusty armory with the sound of hammers ringing in the background, and she felt something crack open in her chest, something she had kept locked for years. "William," she said, and his name felt strange and right on her tongue. "You don't even know me?" "Not really." "I know enough," he said. "I know you steal medicine for sick boys. I know you feed the watch. I know you taught my servants to stack grain because you couldn't stand to see them do it wrong. I know you're afraid of being left behind, and I know you'd rather die than admit it." His gray eyes held hers. "That's more than most people ever let me see." Maggie's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to deflect, to retreat behind her walls of stubborn pride, but the walls felt thinner than they had been, and the man in front of her was looking at her with such patient, unguarded honesty that she could not find the strength to rebuild them. 3 days, she said finally. "Malcolm gave you 3 days. I know. What will you do when they come?" William's jaw tightened. "Whatever I have to." He picked up his cane and leaned on it, and the shift in his posture was subtle but unmistakable. The king was back, the softness tucked away behind the crown. "But I won't be doing. Think it alone. Not anymore." He walked past her toward the door, and Maggie stood by the workbench, watching him go. The limp was more pronounced than it had been yesterday, and she knew he was pushing himself too hard, that the old wound in his knee was screaming for rest it would not get. "William," she called, and he paused at the threshold. "Eat something before you fall over." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I'll consider it, if you promise to sleep tonight." "Fine," she said. "Deal." He nodded, and the door swung shut behind him. Maggie stayed in the armory for a long time after he left, staring at the map on the workbench, at the red lines marking the roads that would soon carry an army toward the castle. And she thought of the way he had touched her scar, the way he had said her name, the way he had looked at her like she was something worth protecting. She did not know if she believed in the deal she had just made. She did not know if she could keep her promise to sleep, or if he would keep his to eat. But for the first time in years, she had made a promise to someone, and she found that she wanted to keep it. The night came colder than the day, and the castle settled into a restless quiet. Maggie lay in her narrow bed in the west tower, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind moan around the battlements. She had eaten her supper, as promised. She had even tried to sleep, as promised, but her mind would not still. She thought of Edmund's warning. She thought of William's certainty. She thought of the map with its red lines and the army that would soon march along them. And she thought of Eleanor, the woman whose name he had whispered in the dark, the woman he had lost, the woman whose ghost still stood between them. Maggie did not know what Eleanor Hector's think like. She did not know how she had died or what William's guilt had to do with it, but she knew what it was like to carry a dead love in your chest, to feel it ache with every heartbeat. She knew what it was like to be haunted. She rose from the bed and pulled on her cloak. The hallways were empty and dark, lit only by the occasional torch. She did not know where she was going until she found herself climbing the stairs to the battlements. The wind was sharp and cold, and the sky was thick with clouds. Maggie stepped out onto the walkway and stopped. William stood at the far end of the wall, looking out toward the Thornwood. His cane was propped against the merlin beside him, and his cloak billowed in the wind. He did not turn when she approached, but she saw his shoulders shift, a small acknowledgement of her presence. "You should be asleep," she said, coming to stand beside him. "So should you." Maggie looked out at the dark landscape beyond the walls, the frozen fields, the distant line of trees that marked the edge of the Thornwood. Somewhere out there, Malcolm was gathering his forces, preparing to march. Somewhere out there, her old life was waiting to claim her.
I used to hate this place, she said quietly. When I first came, I hated the walls, the rules, the way everyone bowed and scraped like they were afraid of their own shadows. I thought it was the most hollow place in the world. And now? Maggie was silent for a moment. Now I don't know what I think. I only know that I don't want to leave. The words hung in the cold air between them. William turned to look at her, and in the dim torchlight she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen before. Not just warmth, but a kind of quiet wonder, as if she had said something he had been waiting his high life to hear.
"Then stay," he said. "When Malcolm comes, stay. When the war is over, stay. Stay and teach my servants to stack grain. Stay and argue with my brother. Stay and refuse to curtsy to me every day for the rest of your life." Maggie's throat tightened. "You don't know what you're asking." "I know exactly what I'm asking." He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the frost forming on his eyelashes, could see the tire lines around his eyes. "I'm asking you to stop running, to stop waiting for the moment when I'll disappoint you, to stop pretending you don't care." His voice dropped. "I'm asking you to stay, Maggie. Not because I'm the king, because I'm asking." The wind howled around them, and the torchlight flickered, and Maggie stood on the battlements of a castle that had become more of a home than any place she had known in years, looking at a man who had seen her scar and called her beautiful anyway. She did not know what the morning would bring. She did not know if Malcolm would come, or if the war would be won, or if the spring would ever arrive. But she knew one thing, with a certainty that surprised her. She did not want to leave. Slowly she reached out, and her fingers found his hand, the hand that gripped the cane, the hand that had touched her scar, the hand of a king who had refused to let her go. She wrapped her fingers around his, and she felt him tighten his grip in a turn. They stood like that for a long time, two lonely people on a cold wall, looking out at a future that was uncertain and terrifying, and for the first time in either of their lives, not quite so lonely. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the frozen fields and the dark trees, a lone wolf howled at the moonless sky. The lone wolf's howl had not been a lone freck at all. It had been a signal. Dawn broke grey and bitter over Ashford Castle, and with it came the scouts, 2 riders caked in mud and frost, their horses lathered and heaving. They did not need to speak. The look on their faces said everything. Malcolm of the Thornwood had come, and he had not come alone. William stood on the battlements, his weight braced on the cane, watching the distant tree line. Maggie stood a pace behind him, her breath fogging in the cold air. She had not slept. Neither had he. They had spent the night on the wall, and when the first scout had ridden through the gates, William had simply reached back and taken her hand, as if to say, "Whatever comes now, we face it together." "His army," Edmund said, climbing the steps with a rolled map under his arm. His voice was flat, professional, but Maggie caught the strain at the corners of his mouth. 300 men. Maybe more. They've camped beyond the frozen river, just out of arrow range. William did not turn. And his terms? Edmund hesitated. He glanced at Maggie, then back at his brother. The same as before. He will withdraw if we surrender the woman he calls a traitor. The wind picked up, sharp and cruel. Maggie felt it cut through her woolen cloak, but she did not shiver. She had known this moment would come. She had been running from it for 20 years. "Then we know where we stand," William said quietly. He turned, and for a moment his grey eyes met Maggie's. There was no fear in them, no doubt, only a calm that she had come to recognize, the calm of a man who had made his decision long ago and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. "Edmund," William said, "call the council. We will meet in the Great Hall in 1 hour, and I want every able-bodied man on the walls by midday." Figo nodded, but he did not move. His jaw worked as if he were chewing on something bitter. "William," he said, and the use of his brother's name instead of his title was deliberate. "I need to speak plainly." "Then speak." 300 men, Edmund said.
We have maybe 150 who can hold a sword. The walls will hold for a siege, but if Malcolm decides to burn the villages and starve us out—" He stopped, his eyes flicking to Maggie again. "There is a way to end this without a single drop of Ashford blood." "By handing her over," William said, and his voice was ice. "By honoring the old laws," Edmund corrected. "She is Thornwood by blood. Her brother-in-law has the right to claim her under the old codes. It is not a question of what is just. It is a question of what is legal." Maggie felt the words land like stones in her chest. She had known this was coming. She had told herself she was ready for it. But hearing it spoken aloud, in the cold light of a warm morning, made something inside her go very still. She stepped forward before William could answer. "Edmund is right," she said. Both brothers turned to look at her. William's face flickered, something between surprise and alarm. "Margaret," he began, but she held up a hand. "Your brother is right," she repeated, her voice steadier than she felt. "Malcolm has the old laws on his side. He has 300 men, and he has a claim on me that goes back further than either of you can undo." She took a breath. "I came to this castle as a stranger. I have no right to drag it into a war." "You have every right," William said, and his voice was low and hard. "You have the right of a woman who was cast out by her own kin. You have the right of a woman who has done nothing but help this castle since the day she arrived." He took a step toward her, the cane biting into the stone. "And you have the right of someone I have asked to stay." "And if staying means your people die?" Maggie asked. "If staying means the villages burn, the children starve, the walls fall, are those deaths on my hands?" "You are not responsible for Malcolm's cruelty," William said, "but I am responsible for what I choose to do about it." Maggie's voice cracked, just slightly. "I have spent 20 years refusing to bow, but I have never asked anyone else to bleed for that refusal. I will not start now." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Edmund looked at his brother, waiting. William looked at Maggie, and something in his grey eyes softened, not with defeat, but with a fierce, quiet tenderness. "You offered me a bargain once," he said. "Your family's grain for the castle's protection. Do you remember?" Maggie blinked. "What does that have to do with—" "Ye asked me to trust you," William said, "and I did. Now I am asking you to trust me." He took another step closer, close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his pale hair. "I will not hand you over. Not to Malcolm, not to the old laws, not to anyone. You are not a debt to be paid, Margaret. You are not a traitor to be claimed. You are—" He stopped, and his voice dropped to something almost too quiet to hear. "You are mine." The word hung in the air between them. Not a possession, a claim, a vow. Maggie felt her throat tighten. She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him he was being a fool, that he was choosing a stubborn, middle-aged woman over the safety of his people, that he would regret this when the walls fell and the blood ran. But the words would not come, because she saw, in his grey yes, that he already knew all of that and he did not care. Edmund let out a long breath. "Then we prepare for war," he said, and there was something almost like resignation in his voice. "I'll muster the men, but William, if this goes wrong, it is on your head." "It is," William said simply. "I will carry it." Edmund turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the frost. Maggie watched him go, then turned back to William. "You should not have said that," she said quietly. "In front of him. In front of anyone." "Why not?" "Because now, if you fall, if this war goes badly, they will say you did it for a woman. They will say you were weak." William smiled, and it was the saddest smile she had ever seen. "Let them say it. I would rather be called weak for choosing you than strong for abandoning you." Maggie could not speak. She stood there, on the wind-blasted battlements, and she felt something crack open in her chest, something she had kept locked for 20 years. Not the anger, not the grief, something softer, something she had no name for. William reached out, and his gloved hand brushed her cheek. "Come," he said. "There is something I want you to see before the fighting starts." He led her down from the wall, through the courtyard where servants were hauling arrow bundles and boiling oil,
past the stables where grooms were saddling horses with grim efficiency. He led her to the small, walled garden behind the kitchen, the one with the frozen rose. The rosebush stood in the corner, its bare branches dark against the gray sky. But at its base, tucked against the frost-hardened earth, there was a tiny green shoot, new life, pushing up through the cold. "You did this," William said. "You brought it back. When I looked at this garden, all I saw was Eleanor's death. You losed and saw a thing worth saving." Maggie stared at the green shoot. "It's just a plant." "It is not," William said. "It is proof that nothing is beyond saving. Not a garden, not a castle, not a man who has spent his whole life believing he was unworthy of being loved." He turned to face her, and the wind caught his pale hair, and for a moment he looked less like a king and more like the boy he must have been before the wars and the losses and the crown. "Whatever happens today," he said, "I want you to know. I have no regrets, not one." Maggie opened her mouth to answer, but before she could, a horn sounded from the walls. Low, long, mournful. The signal every castle in the north dreaded. The enemy had begun to march. William's face hardened. He straightened, the cane biting into the stone as he took his full height. "Stay here," he said. "I will send word when it is over." "No." The word came out of Maggie before she could stop it. "I am coming with you." "Margaret, I am coming with you," she repeated. "I did not come to this castle to hide in a garden while you fight my war. If Malcolm wants me, he can look me in the eye." For a long moment William looked at her, then slowly he nodded. "Then walk beside me," he said, "and let them see who they are really fighting for." They climbed the steps to the battlements together, and the sight that met them stopped Maggie cold. The frozen river was black with men, hundreds of them, their banners snapping in the wind, the grey wolf of the Thornwood. At the head of the column, on a massive black warhorse, sat Malcolm. Even from this distance, she could see his bulk, his scarred face, the way he sat his saddle like a man who had never known doubt. And behind him, among the ranks, she saw them, faces she knew. Men she had grown up with, women she had broken bread with, children who had called her aunt, her people, the people who had cast her out. And then she saw him, a figure near the front of the column, younger than the rest, with the same dark hair as her brother, the same stubborn set to his shoulders. He was thin, gaunt, his armor ill-fitting, but there was no mistaking the face. Maggie's breath left her in a rush. Caleb, her brother, her little brother, the one she had believed dead for 15 years, killed in the same war that had taken her husband, the one she had mourned and buried in her heart, and never stopped grieving. He was alive, and he was standing with Malcolm. The world tilted. Maggie grabbed the stone battlement to steady herself, and William was there, his hand on her arm, his voice distant and urgent in her ear. "Margaret? Margaret, what is it?" She could not answer. She could only stare at the impossible figure on the frozen river, at the brother she had lost and found and lost, again, in the space of a single heartbeat, and somewhere deep in her chest, the fragile hope that had been growing, the hope that had pushed up through the frost like that tiny green shoot, turned to ice. Because if Caleb was alive, and if he had chosen Malcolm's side, then everything she had believed about her past, about her family, about why she had been cast out, all of it was a lie, and she had no idea who she could trust anymore. The wind off the frozen river carried the smell of iron and horses. Maggie stood on the battlement with her hand still gripping the stone, her eyes locked on the impossible figure below. William's voice came again, low and urgent. "Margaret, look at me." She could not look at him. She could only stare at the familiar slope of her brother's shoulders, at the way he stood with his weight on his left leg, just as he had when they were children. 15 years of grief, 15 years of a grave she had never been allowed to visit, and there he stood, alive, wearing the war mark of the Thornwood pack. "William," she said, and her voice came out thin,
That is my brother, my little brother, the one I buried in my heart when I was 25 years old. William's hand tightened on her arm. Are you certain? I raised him, she said. I taught him to skip stones. I held him when he cried for our mother. I would know him in any army, in any darkness, in any life. She finally turned to face William, and he saw that her eyes were not wet. They were clear, and terrible, and cold as the river below. And I need to know why he is standing with the man who cast me out. Below, Malcolm raised his arm, and the Thornwood host fell silent. His voice carried across the ice, rough and mocking. I see you find my brother's widow, Ashford. I trust she has told you what she is, a woman who abandoned her dead husband's name, and now clings to the crown of his enemy. Maggie's hands tightened on the stone. William stepped forward, his voice cutting through the wind. She is not clinging to anything, Malcolm. She is standing where she chose to stand, and I did not bring you here to trade insults. Then why did you bring me here? Malcolm called back. To show me how far the great Ashford has fallen, that he keeps a Thornwood widow in his bed. A murmur ran through the castle guard. Edmund appeared at William's elbow, his face tight with disapproval. My king, he said quietly, this is not the moment for pride. They outnumber us 2-1. If we give her back— William did not look at him. She is not mine to give, he said, and she is not yours to—
Maggie turned to Edmund, and for the first time since the siege began, she smiled, a thin, brittle thing. The great Edmund of House Ashford, so eager to hand a woman back to the man who would see her hanged. Tell me, did your father teach you that, or did you learn it on your own? Edmund flushed. You would do well to remember that you are a guest here, Margaret. I am not a guest, she said quietly. I am not a prisoner. I am a woman who has spent her whole life being traded, cast out, buried, and forgotten, and I am done with it. She looked past Edmund, past the guard, out at the frozen river and the army that had come to take her. I want to speak to my brother. William caught her arm. Margaret, I need to hear it from his mouth, she said. I need to know why. If he chose Malcolm willingly, then I will walk down there myself and surrender, and you can have your peace, but I need to know. William studied her for a long moment. The wind tugged at his silver-streaked hair, and his grey eyes were unreadable. Then he nodded once, and turned to the herald. Sound the parley. I will accompany her to the centre of the breach. Edmund stepped forward, alarmed. My king, that is madness. They could take you both. Then they would have me, and lose the war, William said flatly. Malcolm knows better than to kill a king on a bridge with 100 witnesses. Sound the parley. The horn blew, long and low. The Thornwood host stirred, and Malcolm's face tightened with surprise. Maggie walked beside William down the spiral stair, through the gatehouse, and out onto the wooden bridge that spanned the frozen river. The ice cracked under their boots, the wind bit through her cloak. At the center of the bridge, they stopped. Malcolm rode forward with a small escort,
and beside him, on a roan mare, rode Caleb. Up close, Maggie saw the changes 15 years had carved into her brother's face. The boy she remembered had been round-cheeked and quick to laugh. This man was lean, hollow-eyed, with a scar across his jaw and a wariness in his gaze that made her chest ache. He did not meet her eyes. Caleb, she said softly. He flinched as if the name were a blow. Malcolm dismounted, his boots landing heavy on the planks. So you come to beg, he said, looking at Maggie. I wondered how long it would take. You never could bear to see your brother in danger. I came to hear the truth, Maggie said, and her voice did not shake. And I will not leave this bridge until I have it. Why is my brother alive? And why is he standing with the man who buried my marriage, my name, and my place in the pack? Malcolm's smile was thin and cruel. You think I buried your brother? I saved him. When you ran off with your pride and your refusal to bow, the pack needed a new heir. Your brother was the only one left, so I told him he could live. If he let the world believe he had died with you, a clean break, a new beginning, and he took it. Maggie's breath caught. She looked at Caleb, and this time he met her eyes, and she saw the shame there, raw and old.
"Is that true?" she whispered. Caleb's voice was hoarse. "He said they would kill you if I refused. He said the only way to keep you alive was to let them think I was dead, and to serve him in silence. I believed him." He swallowed hard. "I have believed him for 15 years. Maggie felt the world tilt again, but this time something different rose in her chest. Not ice, but a hot, furious grief. She turned on Malcolm, and her voice rang across the frozen river. "You took my brother's life. You made him a ghoul." "Think Okus's name like a shield, and you have the audacity to call me the traitor." Malcolm's face hardened. "You chose a foreign king over your own blood. That is treason enough for me." "He is not a foreign king to me," Maggie said, and the words came out before she could stop them. "He is the man who has never asked me to bow. He is the man who has never once made me feel like a debt to be repaid. He is the man who fell from his horse in a blizzard because I was too stubborn to stay safe, and he has never once blamed me for it." She turned to William, and something in her face softened. "He is the man I am going to marry." William's gray eyes widened, a flicker of shock crossing his features. Below them, the two armies stirred. Malcolm laughed, a harsh, incredulous sound. "You would marry the man who killed your husband's brother in battle? You would—" "I would," Maggie said, "because he is the first person in my life who has ever made me feel like I am enough. Not because I was useful, not because I was obedient, just because I was me." She stepped forward, and then before anyone could stop her, she lowered herself to one knee on the frozen planks of the bridge. Her knee hit the wood with a dull thud, and she bent her head. And she said in a voice that carried to both armies, "William of House Ashford, I, Margaret of the Thornwood pack, do not kneel to anyone who has not earned it. But you have earned it, and I kneel to you now. Not because you are king, but because you are the man I choose." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And then William moved. He crossed the bridge in 3 long strides, and he did not let her stay on her knee. He caught her by both arms and pulled her to her feet, and when she tried to look away, he cupped her face in his hands and made her meet his eyes. "Margaret," he said, and his voice was rough with something she had never heard in it before. "I did not fall in love with a woman who kneels. I fell in love with the woman who refused to curtsy to a king, who stole medicine for a sick boy, who stood on a battlement and faced down her own brother's ghost. Do not take that woman from me now." She stared at him, her breath catching. "But I am not asking you to kneel," he said. "I am asking you to stand beside me for the rest of your life if you will have me." He raised his voice, and it carried across the river, across both armies, across the frozen world. "Hear me, all of you. This woman is not my hostage, not my servant, not my conquest. She is my wife, and she is my equal, and she will be the co-ruler of this land for as long as I draw breath, and any man who comes for her will come through me." Somewhere in the Thornwood host, a voice cried out, and then another, and another. Maggie looked up, and she saw it. The old warriors, the ones who had served her husband, the ones who had wept when she was cast out, they were lowering their spears. They were stepping forward, away from Malcolm's banner, toward the bridge. Caleb slid off his mare. He walked forward, his face pale, and stopped a few feet from Maggie. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice cracked. "I am so sorry, Maggie. I should have fought. I should have—" "Shh," she said, and she reached out and pulled him into her arms. He was taller than her now, broader, but he buried his face in her shoulder like the boy she remembered, and she held him, and she did not let go. "You are here," she said. "That is enough. We will find our way back to each other." Malcolm stood alone on the bridge, his face twisted with fury. The Thornwood host was dissolving around him, warriors stepping away, families reuniting, the old bonds of blood and loyalty breaking the chains of his command. He looked at William, and his voice was bitter. "You think this is over, Ashford? You think one speech undoes 15 years of—" "It undoes nothing," William said quietly. "It starts something new. And you are not part of it, Malcolm. Go, take your horse and your pride and your cold, empty name. If you are still in this land by nightfall, I will treat you as a raider, not a kinsman." Malcolm stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away across the ice without a single backward glance. The cheering began somewhere in the castle guard, and it spread, a wave of sound that rolled across the frozen river and into the Thornwood host. Maggie stood on the bridge with her brother in her arms, and William stood beside her with his hand on her back, steady and warm. And when the cheering faded, she lifted her head, and she looked at William, and she smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. "I did not curtsy," she said. "I hope you are not disappointed." William laughed, a low, warm sound. "I am the King of the North, Margaret. I have had enough curtsies to last a lifetime. What I have never had is a woman who would look at me like that." He reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb lingering on the old scar above her brow. "I would rather have you standing beside me than kneeling before me. Every time." She took his hand and she squeezed it, and she said softly, "Then I will stand, for as long as you will have me." "Forever," he said. "That should be long enough." And somewhere in the city behind them, in the quiet garden that once belonged to a dead queen, a single green shoot pushed up through the frost, reaching toward the pale winter sun. The winter broke slowly, the way it always did in the north. First the ice on the mill pond softened, then the roads turned to mud. Then the first pale greens spread across the hills like a held breath finally released. Spring came to the Thornwood not with a flourish, but with a patient, stubborn insistence, much like the woman who now walked the castle corridors as though she had always belonged there. Maggie still refused to curtsy. That had not changed. What had changed was the way she moved through the keep. She no longer kept her shoulders squared against an expected blow. She stopped flinching when someone called her name from behind, and she had begun, without quite noticing it, to say "our castle" instead of "your castle" when she spoke to William. Old Nora noticed, of course. The cook had a way of noticing everything, usually with a pie in hand. "You said our," Nora said one morning, sliding a hot pastry across the kitchen table. "Took you long enough, dearie?" Maggie bit into the pastry and said nothing, but her ears turned pink. The rebuilding of the Thornwood had begun in earnest. The granaries that Malcolm's men had threatened to burn were being restocked. The village that had huddled behind the castle walls all winter was returning to its fields. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Maggie found herself with a title she had never asked for, and a role she was still learning to wear. William had simply announced it, the way he announced everything, with the quiet finality of a man who did not expect to be argued with. "Margaret of the Thornwood is my wife and my co-ruler," he had said. "She speaks with my voice when I am absent. Think decides with my authority when I cannot. If you have a grievance, you bring it to her. If you have a need, you bring it to her. She is not a guest in this castle. She is its lady." The lords and elders had bowed. Some of them had meant it. Maggie had stood there jaw tight and waited until the hall emptied before she turned to him and said, "You could have asked me." "I did ask you," William replied. "You said yes, or have you forgotten?" "I said yes to you, not to the whole bloody kingdom." "You are the kingdom," he said simply, and then he had limped off to inspect the repairs, leaving her standing in the middle of the hall with her mouth half open. The limp was worse now. The fall from the horse and the blizzard had done something to his left knee that the castle healers could not fully undo. William pretended it did not hurt. He always pretended. But Maggie had learned to read the small signs, the way he gripped the banister a little too hard on the stairs, the way he favored his right leg when he thought no one was watching. She did not fuss over him. That was not who she was. But she had taken to leaving a stool near the hearth in their chambers, in exactly the spot where he could prop his leg up without admitting that he needed to. And she had told the kitchen to steep willow bark tea every evening, and she made sure a cup was always waiting on his desk by the time he sat down to review the day's reports. He never thanked her for it. She never expected him to. But one evening he looked at the steaming cup, then at her, and said, "You are the only person who has ever noticed." "Noticed what?" "That I am not as strong as I pretend to be." Maggie sat down across from him. "Everyone pretends," she said. "The trick is finding someone who pretends with you." William was wired for a long moment. Then he reached across the desk and took her hand. "I am glad it is you," he said.
She squeezed his fingers. I am glad it is me too. The days settled into a rhythm. Mornings were for the fields and the granaries. Afternoons were for the endless stream of petitions and disputes that came with ruling a territory that was slowly stitching itself back together. Evenings were for the two of them, sometimes in silence, sometimes in conversation, always in a kind of quiet companionship that Maggie had never known she was capable of. It was Edmund who finally broke the tension between them. The steward had been stiff and formal since the day she arrived, a man who believed in rules the way other men believed in gods. But one night, after a long council meeting, he stopped her in the corridor. "Lady Margaret," he said, and the title sounded strange in his mouth. "I owe you an apology." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "For which part?" Adam's jaw tightened, but he pressed on. "I thought you were a threat to my brother, to the stability of this house. I was wrong." "You were not entirely wrong," Maggie said. "I was a threat, to the idea that a king must never be questioned." Edmund blinked. "And now?" "Now I am a threat to the idea that a king must be alone." She met his eyes. "Your brother has spent his whole life believing that no one could love him without wanting something in return. I am here to prove him wrong, that is all." Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly he inclined his head. "The castle is better with you in it, Lady Margaret." Maggie almost smiled. "Careful. That almost sounded like a compliment." "I am told I have been practicing," Edmund said dryly, and walked away. The hardest part was Caleb. Her brother had returned from leaks. Think up one time. Then the joy of that reunion had carried them through the first weeks. But joy, Maggie was learning, did not erase 15 years of silence. It did not make up for the fact that she had mourned him, that she had lit candles for a grave that held no body, that she had carried the weight of his death like a stone in her chest for half her life. And Caleb carried his own weight, the guilt of having obeyed Malcolm's threat, of having let her believe he was dead to protect her, of having hidden in the shadows while she suffered alone. They did not speak of it at first. They circled each other like two wary animals, rebuilding the shape of a sibling bond that had been shattered. It was old Nora who finally broke the stalemate, in her usual fashion. Two stubborn Thornwoods, both too proud to say the thing that needs saying, the cook muttered, shoving a tray of bread into Maggie's hands. "Take this to your brother, and if you do not talk to him, I will tell the king that you have been stealing pies from my kitchen." "You would not dare," Maggie said. "Try me, dearie." So Maggie found herself on the ramparts one cold spring evening, a tray of bread in her hands, and her brother standing at the edge of the wall, looking out over the land he had not seen in 15 years. "You missed the view," she said, coming to stand beside him. Caleb did not turn. "I missed a lot of things." They stood in silence for a while. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and new growth. Somewhere down in the village, a dog barked and a child laughed. "I used to dream about you," Maggie said quietly. "In the worst winters, when the snow would not stop and the food ran low, I used to dream that you came back, that you walked through the door with mud on your boots and told me you had just been freak longer than expected." Caleb's shoulders tightened. "Maggie, let me finish." She set the bread down on the parapet. "I was so angry at you, Caleb. For years, I was so angry. I thought you had abandoned me. I thought you had chosen Malcolm over your own sister. And then I found out that you had done it to save my life, and I did not know whether to kiss you or hit you." "I would have deserved the hitting," Caleb said. "You still might get it, but—" Her voice had softened. "But I understand now. I understand what it cost you to make that choice, and I am not going to pretend that 15 years can be undone in 15 days. Caleb finally turned. His eyes were wet. "I did not know how to come back to you. I did not know if you would want me." Maggie reached out and took his hand. It was larger than she remembered, rougher, worn by years of hidden labor, but it was her brother's hand, and she held it tight. "You are my blood," she said. "You will always be my blood. The rest we will figure out together." Caleb's breath hitched. And then, without warning, he pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she thought her ribs might crack. "I am sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I am sorry, Maggie. I am so sorry." She held him back. I know you are."
They stood there on the ramparts, 2 Thornwood survivors, and for the first time in 15 years they let themselves be a brother and a sister again. The rose bloomed in the first week of spring. Maggie found it on a morning when the dew was still heavy on the grass. She had been walking to the garden out of habit, to check on the plants she had been nursing through the winter, and there it was. A single deep red bloom unfurled to the pale morning sun on the bush that had once belonged to a dead queen.
She stopped. She stared. And then she knelt in the damp earth and touched the petals with the tips of her fingers. It was not the first rose she had ever grown, but it was the first one that felt like a forgiveness. She stayed there for a long time, her knees soaked through, her hands resting in the soil. She thought about Eleanor, the woman who had planted this rose and died without anyone truly knowing her. She thought about William, who had kept the garden locked for years because he could not bear to look at it. She thought about all the things that withered and died, and all the things that somehow found a way to grow again. When she finally stood, William was standing at the garden gate watching her. "You found it," he said. Maggie nodded. It bloomed. He walked over slowly, favoring his left leg, and stood beside her. Together they looked at the single red rose. "Eleanor would have liked you," William said quietly. "She always said I needed someone who would not let me get away with my own nonsense." Was I nonsense? "You are the most infuriating woman I have ever met," he said, "and I would not have you any other way." Maggie laughed, a low, warm sound. Then she reached out and took his hand. "Come with me," she said. "There is something I want to do." The castle gathered at the gates that afternoon for the first time since the war. The word had spread that the lady wanted to make an announcement, and the courtyard was full of people, lords and servants, villagers and soldiers, all of them curious about what the woman who had once refused to curtsy had to say. Maggie stood at the top of the steps, William beside her. She looked out over the crowd and she felt the weight of their eyes on her. She had never wanted this. She had never wanted to be seen, to be watched. Think, seeing it, even, making herself small, invisible, safe. And yet here she was, standing in the light, with a king at her side and a people at her feet. She took a breath, and then she did something that made the entire courtyard go silent. She curtsied. Not a deep curtsy, not a grand one. Just a small, deliberate dip of her knees, a lowering of her head, a gesture of respect that she had refused to give on the night she arrived. And she did it not because she was forced to, not because she was afraid, but because she had finally understood that bending did not have to mean breaking. William watched her for a long moment, and then, to the astonishment of every person in the courtyard, the Alpha King stepped forward, took her by the hand, and pulled her up. "You never have to curtsy to me," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "Not now, not ever. I would rather have you standing beside me than kneeling before me. Every time." Maggie's eyes glistened. "I was not kneeling, William. I was thanking." "Then thank me by staying," he said, "by being here, by being mine." She smiled, and the smile reached her eyes. "Then I will stay," she said, "for as long as you will have me." "Forever," he said. "That should be long enough." The crowd erupted in cheers. Somewhere in the back, old Nora was openly weeping into a pie. Edma was pretending to be very interested in a crack in the stonework, and Caleb was smiling, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. Maggie looked at her brother, and she looked at the man who had become her husband, and she looked at the people who had become her people. She had come to this castle as a woman who refused to bow. She would leave it. No, she would stay in it, as a woman who had finally learned that strength was not in the straightness of one's spine, but in the willingness to bend without breaking. The rose in the garden bloomed on, and in the courtyard of the Ashford Keep, in the first spring of a new beginning, a woman who had once refused to curtsy stood at the side of a king who had never known how to be loved, and together they faced the sun and the years and the long, uncertain road ahead, hand in hand, forever. She refused to bend her knee, and instead found an Alpha King who chose to stand by her side against the world. Margaret and William proved that true love doesn't demand submission, it demands an equal.
Would you have held your ground in that locked ballroom? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more epic romance.